Hi, everyone, and welcome to Conservation Conversations. I'm your host, Casey Tarian, and I am TLC's Development Manager. I'm so excited to have you all here with us tonight. We have a really wonderful presentation from my colleague, Margaret Sands. And if you're just joining us through the chat and logging in, please take a moment to find the chat button on the bottom of your screen. We want to know where you're logging in from and some way that you gave or received a little TLC, Tender Love and Care this week. We've been getting some wonderful messages about people getting some chocolate chip muffins from their neighbors, folks that have been visiting our nature preserves, and someone almost stepped on a snake, but luckily they didn't bite this person, and so they considered that some TLC. And I would agree with that. We have some folks from Raleigh and Durham, Chapel Hill, and so welcome everyone. We're so excited that you're here. And we're very excited that someone's birthday, daughter's birthday was yesterday, and despite the restrictions, made the most of everything going on. So again, welcome. We're very excited to have you. In the wake of the rapidly changing COVID-19 pandemic, TLC hopes that you are taking care of yourselves during this time. In order to continue to connect with you while also practicing social distancing, TLC is excited to introduce its virtual series, Conservation Conversations. Every Wednesday evening through April, we will host a guest speaker who will share information about the work they are doing to make the Triangle a healthier and more vibrant region. You will have an opportunity to connect with a speaker through the Q&A section, and while we hope to answer most of your questions, please note that we may not be able to answer all of them in the time allotted. Please take a moment to locate the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. This is where you should submit all your questions. You may also send us questions via email to advancement@triangleland.org, and I'll put that email in the chat function so you can have access to that. Like many of you, TLC staff and guest speakers are logging in remotely, so please bear with us as the internet might be slower than normal. You might hear an occasional dog bark or cats meow, children, partners, or roommates' voices. As you may know, Triangle Land Conservancy, or TLC, was founded in 1983 by a group of dedicated citizens who were concerned about balancing growth and conservation of open space in the Triangle region. Together with thousands of members, we protected over 20,000 acres of land and 141 miles of stream across Wake, Orange, Durham, Johnston, Lee, and Chatham counties. TLC strives to create a healthier and more vibrant Triangle region by safeguarding clean water, protecting natural habitats, supporting local farms and food, and connecting people with nature through land protection and stewardship, catalyzing community action and collaboration. Our work is possible because of the support of members like you and our sponsors. Tonight, I am joined by my colleague, Margaret Sands, TLC's Conservation Manager. Margaret joined the TLC team 4.5 years ago as a Community Engagement Coordinator. Before that, she worked at a nonprofit environmental law firm in her home state of South Carolina. After 3 years on the advancement team helping to connect people with nature through community partnerships and events, she transitioned to the conservation team at the end of 2018. Since then, she's been putting her outreach skills to work, finding new land projects for TLC to conserve, and working with partners to secure funding and lay plans for wild and working lands to support our community. Margaret, the webinar is now yours.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, thanks so much. So as Casey mentioned, I started out in the advancement team at TLC, so I got the opportunity to meet several of you back when we were allowed to gather in the real world. So I really appreciate you coming out to join us tonight in this new platform. And I also got to become familiar with many layers of TLC's work and impact in the Triangle. So I'm going to share some of that with you tonight. So for the past year and a half, since I joined the conservation team, I've been learning the details of the conservation process and how it works for us at TLC. And so I'm going to talk you through that process tonight from start to stewardship, but I promise we won't be here for a year and a half. So one of the first things that surprised me about our process is that most of our conservation projects find us instead of the other way around. And that's because of a key tenet of our work. We only work with willing landowners to complete voluntary conservation projects. So this is a big part of what drew me personally to conservation in the first place, and it's the cornerstone of all our projects. So when a landowner calls us, we already know the most important thing about their property, that it's owned by someone who's willing to consider conservation. So people find us through all sorts of ways, but most often it's somehow linked back to word of mouth. So a family member who might have worked with us before or is a member of TLC may nudge someone to call. My first project was actually with a landowner in Chatham County who had attended a landowner information event we hosted nearly a decade before. And this month I'm working on a project that one of our members saw posted for sale on their neighborhood listserv and called to tell us about. So that's why all the hikes, events, and even virtual gatherings like this one are so integral to our mission. Because the more people who know what we do, the more connections we have to our community and the wild and working lands in it. So tonight I'm walking you through what happens when the phone rings and there's a willing landowner on the other end ready to conserve their land. So the first thing I need to know is what county is someone calling from? TLC is one of many land trusts in the country. There's land trusts across the US and across North Carolina, and they're very geographically based. So TLC only works in these 6 counties: Orange, Durham, Chatham, Lee, Wake, and Johnston. And there are other organizations that cover the rest of North Carolina. So we've been working in these 6 counties since 1983, and these green dots are our projects where we've conserved over almost 21,000 acres, excuse me. So if someone's calling from outside of our territory, we can still help them because there are partner land trusts working across the state and across the country, offering very similar programs and opportunities. So when someone calls from an area we don't serve, I can share some general information and then direct them to their local land trust. So if you're wondering about your local land trust, you can use this findalandtrust.org tool that's run by the Land Trust Alliance. But if they are calling from somewhere in the Triangle Land Conservancy territory, one of our 6 counties, I use a few simple tools to learn more about their land quickly. So for that, I use some online mapping tools that you can actually use too. So here we're looking at Chatham County's GIS tool. Actually, every county has some sort of GIS server that is open to the public and anyone can use. Chatham County just happens to have a really cool one because they have a conservation viewer. So this is a lot of the information that we as a conservation organization are interested in, and we can zoom in down to a parcel level to see not only who owns a certain piece of property, but some of the important conservation details about it as well. So this randomly chosen property, for example, we can see that it has some private protection. It's marked as a managed area. And it has significant natural heritage area on it too. And we have a stream layer here. So looking at this one, we can see, oh, well, it's owned by Triangle Land Conservancy. And Triangle Land Conservancy is a nonprofit organization, and this happens to be White Pines Nature Preserve that does have a lot of significant natural heritage area and wonderful trails that are still open to the public. So that's one of the tools that I can use to see who owns a property and some of the conservation features of it. Even if you're not in Chatham County though, there are other tools that you can use. So this is one that's called the TEAM tool, which is put out by the Clean Water Management Trust Fund. So it actually has some information on some of the state funding sources in the area. It also has that natural heritage data. And this one has some interesting things about historic points. So here you could see, for example, that Stagville State Historic Site is here and that there are several historic points of interest. And this is a useful one when talking to landowners, because you can actually generate a report on some of this information. So you could send someone data on their land that they can keep. And finally, this is the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program, which has a website with all sorts of great information on it. And this is their interactive mapping tool. So you can see here, these colorful areas are significant natural heritage areas that have been identified by this state agency as important areas for wildlife and rare species. And then if I click this on, these are our managed areas. So these are protected by organizations like Triangle Land Conservancy, but also some of our municipalities. So it's important for me to know when someone's calling if they're near some of these areas, because in our new strategic vision, we're trying to protect 75% of any unprotected natural heritage sites. And we're also trying to add an additional 1,000 acres to our preserves. But we also really value buffering, creating corridors through buffering and working to fill these gaps between other managed areas. So those are just a few tools that you might like to use and that we use when someone calls interested in conservation. And so when I'm looking at those various parcels, I'm looking for a few things in TLC's criteria, one of them being size. And we don't have a hard and fast rule, but typically we're looking at parcels that are about 20 acres or above in most of the areas that we work in. And we're looking for our 4 main public benefits. So that's connecting people with nature. So opportunities for public nature preserves, like some of the ones mentioned in the intro. Protecting natural habitats, like those significant natural heritage areas where important wildlife is found. Supporting local farms and food. All those tools that I just showed you also have soil data on them, which can help us identify prime farmland. And safeguarding clean drinking water. So a lot of times, one of the first things I look for is the stream layer on all of those tools and what water there might be on a piece of property, because that links back to a lot of our priorities as an organization and a lot of our funding sources. So next, I want to meet the land and the landowner face to face. So that usually means a site visit. Obviously not right now, but we did get several in right before the social distancing. So of course, I like to get out and see the land, and I try to dress the part. So here I am in my sheep sweater on a sheep farm. And the site visit is important to each of us in order for us to be able to clarify our goals for the land. So for TLC, it comes down to our selection criteria, some of which you can see here in this form, including our 4 public benefits. But we're also looking for things like wildlife connectivity, connecting to other protected lands, potential for management. So I have a checklist that I go through when I meet with a landowner, but I also want it to be an opportunity for them to clarify their goals. Because as a landowner, it's important for you to consider what conservation could mean in the very long term. We only do conservation projects that are going to last in perpetuity. So that means when you commit to conservation with TLC, you're not just committing yourself, you're committing future generations. And so it's important to understand what that means and what you're agreeing to do. So we talk through what specific conservation tools are available. And we talk through questions like, what are your family's goals and interests in your land? Who do you want to manage your land? Do you want to keep managing it, or are you looking for another entity to do that? Do you plan to live on the land, to farm the land? And why are you considering conservation? So we usually just talk through all of these factors. And from that, it becomes clear whether or not conservation is going to be a viable option, and then we encourage people to speak with their families, and then we embark on our conservation process. So this is sort of a summary of what we go through in a typical conservation project, and you'll receive a copy of this in your resources that you'll get after this presentation. So after the site visit, we're kind of in this stage. So the landowner is deciding, is conservation right for my land? And so next we have to go through TLC's approval processes. So that means if a landowner decides that they would like to carry forward with conservation, I've already assessed the property and looked at that form. And if it's checked enough boxes for conservation values for TLC, so we usually try and have at least 2 of those public benefits and some of the other criteria on that form. And then we take it to the wider staff. So in particular over here, are some of our members of our conservation team. And so these people help us to look at our priorities as an organization and think about what kind of a commitment we're taking on when we're accepting a new conservation project. Because not only does it take time to close a project, but we're also committing to steward that land in perpetuity. So we try and make that a pretty collaborative process. If that goes well, then next we go to the board. And so the board approval process is to go through the Conservation Strategies Committee, which actually met this morning. And so they see summaries of all of our projects. And the Conservation Strategies Committee is made up of experts in the community with lots of different backgrounds and expertise, all related to land management. They make a recommendation to the TLC Board of Directors, who also approves all projects. So both of those entities have to approve a project before we can officially work on conserving it. So I was pretty short on board pictures, but this is actually a good representation. We have Sandy, our executive director here, and then Danielle and Mavis are both on our board. Mavis is our board chair. And then this was from our board reunion. But even just in this picture, you can see we have a farmer, we have a forester, we have someone from soil and water, an heirs property attorney, and a professor of planning. So we really rely on our board's input and their advice when it comes to our conservation projects. So once if a landowner has decided that conservation is the right fit and there are conservation values on the property that meet TLC's basic criteria, then there are 3 main paths that a project can follow, what we think of as the conservation toolbox. And usually it's in that first meeting with the landowner that we decide together which tool would be right for them. But I'm going to take you through each of them now. So first is transfers and assists, then fee simple projects, and finally conservation easements. So transfers and assists, we're not going to go too deep into because it's a little less common. We usually work with our municipal partners on transfers and assists. So that's an opportunity for us to help our government agencies in land projects. So these are 2 examples of land projects where we helped out with the government purchase of properties. So Little River Regional Park was a collaboration between Orange County and Durham County, with TLC assisting to acquire the land for that now public park. And then Stagville State Historic Site is the property that I showed on the map before in northern Durham County that's adjacent to Horton Grove Nature Preserve. And this site is actually owned and managed now by the Stagville State Historic Site, but TLC helped to acquire that land, and we collaborated on the grand opening, and this is a picture from that day. So another tool in the conservation toolbox is fee simple transactions. So that is placing land in permanent ownership and stewardship of a land trust. That means that the land trust owns and manages that piece of property outright, like any landowner. People have asked me several times why it's called fee simple, and even in looking it up, it seems like it's just the most complete form of ownership. But having done both kinds of paperwork, I can tell you that the fee simple paperwork is a lot simpler, so that's my definition. And so fee simple projects come to us either through donation of land, bequest, someone leaving it in their will, or through a bargain sale where they donate a part of the value. So quiz time. What Triangle Land Conservancy fee simple lands have you visited? You can put it in the chat box there. See if you've been to any of our properties. All right. Pete has been to Horton Grove, Brumley, and White Pines. That's right, all fee simple lands owned by TLC. Casey's been to Johnston Mill, White Pines, Horton Grove, Brumley, Irvin Farm. And Michael has been to White Pines and Williamson. Bill's been to Johnston Mill and Brumley. Sean, Johnston Mill, and Williamson Preserve. Oh, and Chuck Rose, an overachiever, he's been to most of them, so. All right, so that's right. So fee simple projects, since TLC owns and manages them, we own nearly 12,000 acres and we manage that land. And some of it, not all of it, we have opened up to the public as public nature preserves. So we have 7, almost 8 public nature preserves. Our 8th public nature preserve was supposed to open later this month, but we're excited to get it open sometime in the near future. And so even the properties that are not open to the public, we are holding those in perpetuity for those same 4 public benefits. So most of our lands have at least one, but usually multiple of those public benefits: wildlife habitat, clean water, farms and food, or connecting people with nature. So we maintain them in perpetuity for those purposes. Okay, so one of the ways that we acquire fee simple lands is through donation. So sometimes people decide to donate their land outright to us, and TLC is a 501c3 organization, so we can accept those donations and there can be some tax benefits for the donor. This is an example of a recent donation that we have. This is the Council family, and they donated a property in Wake County that's actually on the White Oak Greenway in Cary, so White Oak Creek Greenway, excuse me. And so they donated that 23 acres outright to us, and so we are able to maintain the greenway and conserve that property. Another example of a donation was Horton Grove Nature Preserve that I mentioned earlier. So Stagville State Historic Site is here, and then Horton Grove and the trail system is up in this area. It's actually 700 acres, so it's our largest nature preserve. And it was donated to us through some relationships we had with a nearby developer who was working on a home site, or several, and they worked with our staff at the time and the state in order to donate a portion of that property. An example of a purchase or bargain sale is Brumley Nature Preserve, which I know several of you have visited. So this is an example of a time when we pool resources to secure enough funding in order to conserve a piece of property. So in the case of Brumley, we had lots of partners, including the Clean Water Management Trust Fund, Warner Foundation, and the City of Raleigh through the Upper Neuse Clean Water Initiative, our own Land Opportunity Fund, and our donors. And that, by pooling those funds, we got enough capital, and then the Zeiss Foundation, who owned the property at the time, donated the rest of the value. So that's what makes it a bargain sale. We also have received lands through bequests. So that's when we partner with a living landowner to plan for what's going to happen to their land after their passing. So that was the case with the Irvin Nature Preserve, which several of you had been to. This is in Orange County, and this belonged to Mrs. Irvin, and she lived on the land until her passing, and she was very clear that she wanted the land to be used for agriculture and for education, but she did not want it to be open to the public. So it does not have a public trail system, but it does have an outdoor kindergarten, learning outside on it, and Transplanting Traditions, which is a refugee program and farm for Karen refugees from Burma. And they farm the land and have a CSA, and they are still running their CSA if you'd like to support them. So that is an example of a bequest, and Mrs. Irvin worked extensively with TLC staff to be explicit about her wishes so that we could agree on the conservation values of the property and how it would be managed in the future. Okay, the next tool in the toolbox is a conservation easement, which is a voluntary legal agreement between a landowner and a qualified conservation organization like TLC that permanently limits certain uses of the land to protect the conservation values. So it's unique to each landowner and their goals and their properties, and it's not one size fits all. So essentially, each of our conservation easements removes the right to develop from the land. So as a landowner, everyone has certain rights, and one of those is the right to develop, to divide your land into multiple lots and put additional buildings on it. And so this removes the right to develop, and it binds both current and future landowners forever. So we say that it runs with the land. So this is an example of a recent conservation easement that we closed, and it has significant natural heritage area like we saw on that tool at the beginning. And there's even some element occurrences because it's along the river here. So there's several of our public benefits at play here. And so the restrictions of this conservation easement were in order to protect that wildlife habitat. So the conservation easement restricted building to this 3-acre building envelope. So there's already a house here. The landowner can continue to live there, can even sell the house and the property if she chooses, but she couldn't cut down all the forest and build 10 more houses up here, even if she really wanted to or a future landowner wanted to. That's against the restrictions in the easement. So conservation easements are an appealing option for landowners because you can keep your land in your hands, in your family, maintain your own ownership, but protect its conservation values. So you can keep farming your land, as many of our landowners do. One of our landowners owns Green Button Farm in Durham County. That's pictured here. So it's a sustainable hog farm that supplies all of the pigs for Picnic Durham. And so they have done a few conservation easements with us in order to protect the streams on the property and keep the property in farming, but it can never be developed. And so even with the conservation easement, the owner can still sell, gift, bequeath, or mortgage the property, and that easement will go with the deed of the property and bind anyone who owns it in the future. There can be significant estate and income tax benefits. We always encourage landowners to speak with their tax advisors because everybody's situation is different, but there is value associated with the development rights of your property. So severing that value from your property can either be considered a donation to TLC, a 501c3, or sometimes there's funding available for some easement purchases. And we do make sure we work very closely with the landowners and try and make sure that the easement is tailored to meet their needs. So it's a great option for a lot of our landowners. And in our resources that we'll send out, we actually have a video with interviews with several of our landowners where you'll get to hear from them directly. It's just hard to play over a platform like this. So next we're gonna talk through, we've met with the landowner, we've decided which conservation tool we're gonna use, and now it's time to apply for some funding. So we're sort of here in this middle step. So even if a landowner decides to fully donate their conservation easement or their property, there are still transaction costs that are associated with any land deal. So all of these things in this area here, so an appraisal, a survey, transaction screen, a baseline documentation report. So a lot of these are field work, and field work can be a lot of fun, but it does have costs associated with it. So even a fully donated project can accumulate up to several $1,000s in costs, depending on the elements of the project at play. So we're always trying to find ways to cover those costs. There's also the cost of time. Each project tends to be about 150 hours of staff time. And then we kind of double that every time we need to apply for a funding source. So some of the funding sources who can help us to cover not just those transaction costs, but also the value of the development rights of a project or of a property itself, if that's in the interests of the landowner, are the North Carolina Agricultural Development and Farmland Preservation Trust. They specifically support family farms in North Carolina. And the USDA has an easement program as well. And Clean Water Management Trust Fund, as their name implies, they protect the water resources in the state. And Triangle Community Foundation can help to cover those transaction costs specifically. So applying for these programs is a big part of the middle section of the conservation process. And to complicate matters, all of these have their own separate restrictions and they all require a match. So they have to get there. No one wants to fully fund a project. They need buy-in from either the landowner to donate some value or from another organization to put funding into that project. So depending on what county we're in, that can open up some more options for funding. Wake County, for example, just passed an open space bond and they just had their first round of applications for funding for Wake County projects in January. We put in a lot of applications and we're really excited about that prospect and we're hoping to get some great projects conserved with that funding. We also work a lot with the Upper Neuse Clean Water Initiative, which is a program of the city of Raleigh, which gets its drinking water from Falls Lake. And so it's in the best interest of the city of Raleigh Water Management to protect the upstream areas that filter their drinking water so it's as clean as possible when it gets to their drinking water source and can save money in the long run for water treatment. So with funding from that source, which comes from the individual water users to pay a 15-cent fee per 1,000 gallons, we've been able to conserve with our partners, fellow land trusts in the area. We've conserved 124 properties over the 14 years of that program and about 121 miles of stream. And now the city of Durham has a similar program where when we pay our water bill in the city of Durham, 2 cents per 1,000 gallons goes towards protecting the land in the Lake Mickey and Little River Reservoir watersheds. And we're hoping to pass a similar program for Jordan Lake that would allow for protection of upstream areas in the Jordan Lake watershed. So for us in our territory, that would be Chatham and Orange and Durham counties. But we're also working with partners all the way upstream into Rockingham and Guilford and Alamance counties as part of the Jordan Lake One Water Initiative. So our goal is over the next 35 years to protect 35,000 acres in the watershed. And this is the funding mechanism that would be modeled on the Upper Neuse Clean Water Initiative to gather the funds in order to do that. So now in the conservation process, hopefully we've gotten approved for all the funding and then you put all those transaction costs into place. So you get the survey done and you finish the baseline documentation report and determine the easement language and the final documents and plans for the property. And then it is time to close. So that's obviously the most exciting part for everyone, but we get to close projects with landowners and make official their commitment to conservation. So that means something different for each project. If it's a fee simple project, then we start making a management plan. But if it's a conservation easement like this project, then it's an ongoing relationship so the landowner can keep living on the property if they so choose, and we'll continue to work with them on how that property is conserved. So over the years, 37 years, we've closed on 216 projects, which is just shy of 21,000 acres. And over the next 5 years, we're hoping to double the pace of conservation by conserving 25,000 acres total. And so 5,000 in the next 5 years would double the pace of conservation in the triangle. And so even once we've closed a project, there's no real closing to the conservation process because all of our projects are in perpetuity. So there's no start to finish, it is start to stewardship. So each of our projects, whether it's a fee simple project that TLC is going to manage for habitat and for some of our public benefits, then Matt Matt Rutledge, our Associate Director of Stewardship, works on those fee simple projects and how they're going to be managed. And you can see him planting trees here. So he is going to elaborate on his process next week. And if it's a conservation easement, then we'll go out every year to monitor that property and make sure that the agreements that we've put in place are being respected, and meet with every new landowner who comes to own one of our conservation easement properties. And that is the job of Caroline Durham, who is pictured here at one of our prescribed burns. And she goes out and meets with landowners every year in order to check up on our conservation easements. And so she'll be talking about her process next week as well. So I hope you can join us then. Okay, and that's it from me. So Casey, do we have any questions?
We do. As a reminder, if you have any questions for Margaret, I will put her email in the chat box if you'd like to submit them directly to her. But if you'd like to ask her right now, please locate the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen and please submit your questions there. Again, we may not be able to answer all of them in the time allotted, but we'll go through a few of them in the amount of time that we have left. We have a question from Sean V. He asks, are there any opportunities to volunteer during the conservation process?
Let's see. So during the conservation process, one of the things, it's not really an official volunteer job, but we do always want people to be our ambassadors and be our stewards. Like I said at the beginning of the presentation, most of our land deals come to us through word of mouth. And so we really appreciate people showing up at events, hikes, getting the word out, and introducing us to new people so that people know that these conservation tools are available and how we can put them into play. And also monitoring our conservation easements is an ongoing job into perpetuity. So that's another great way for people to be involved, is to help us monitoring with our conservation easement projects. So right now, most of our in-person volunteer opportunities are on hold, but we're looking forward to activating our enthusiastic volunteers once again.
Great. We have two questions from Bruce. Bruce asks, does TLC support any archaeological studies on its properties? And then the second question, is there a goal for balance of projects between the various North Carolina counties?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's for the first question about archaeological excavations, it's sort of property to property so far. So we did work very closely with Stagville State Historic Site for our Horton Grove property, and for several of the properties in that area. We actually have another property there that we called Snow Hill, but is now being called the Catawba Trail Farm. And we worked with a local expert who's familiar with the Catawba Trail, the trading paths, to identify an ancient road that had been used by Native Americans there, and try and gather information on how that property had been used by Native peoples. And Stagville State Historic Site has a wonderful resource for families of enslaved people and the artifacts left behind, and the preservation of those sites. So we worked closely with them on the naming of our trail systems, and we also still work with them on events. And we recently just finished a project with the UNC Community Histories program at our Williamson Preserve. And that one is looking at the, I guess mostly the agricultural history there and some of the oral history that is still surviving in the Shoutwell community. I will say we usually tend to have more of a focus on the archaeological significance of the site when it's going to be open to the public, because we think it's important to share those stories with our community. But it's not one of the things that we do internally. We rely on our community partners for that. So it sort of depends on who's available in the area. And I'm sorry, what was the second part, Casey?
The second question was, are there goals to balance for balance of projects between the various counties throughout North Carolina?
Okay. Yeah, so we share some of the goals across our 6 county regions. So those 4 public benefits, we want to achieve those in any county. But what it comes down to is funding. So some of our areas have more funding for projects than others, and that can make a big difference for a landowner. It's not everyone can afford to donate their conservation project, and we fully understand that, and we try and make it feasible for a landowner to be able to participate in a conservation project. So counties where there are funding opportunities like the Upper Neuse Clean Water Initiative, we end up doing a lot of work in those counties, Wake County as well, because of the new open space bond, where there are funding resources that are gonna make those projects happen. We do prioritize selecting some of those projects in those counties.
Great. We have a question from Catherine Smith. Catherine would like for you to expand more upon the bargain sale option. What other attributes beyond the requirement for partners does it have?
Okay. Yeah, so for a bargain sale, it's kind of just a way of saying that property is being sold at a discount to the land trust, because usually the landowner has conservation intent. So it's not someone who's trying to get the top price for their land. They're willing to donate a portion of the value in order for those conservation values that they also hold dear to be protected on their land. So it's sort of case by case, depending on what funding sources are available and the capacity of the landowner as far as how each budget breaks down. So it's not a hard and fast, like that they have to donate this portion, or that there's a certain number that we have to get to. It really depends on what funding sources they're eligible for and what they're comfortable with. So a bargain sale is how we do most of our projects, because most of our landowners are bought into the idea of conservation and willing to help us fill the gap on funding to make it happen.
Mavis would like to know, what's the average payment to a landowner giving an easement?
Ooh, that is a good question, and one that I don't feel that I have the information at my fingertips to answer. It really depends. There can be such drastic differences between acreage and per acre value, depending on where you are. So in 1 week, I spoke with 2 landowners in 2 different parts of our region. And one was the estimate for their land pre-appraisal, but an estimate was $40,000 an acre, and the other was $1,500 an acre. So it can be really different depending on mostly the development pressure in that particular part of our region. And so it really just depends. And so we also have sizes that run the gambit for someone's conservation project. So we've had just recently a project that was 27 acres, And then we're also talking with a landowner who has 275 acres. So those would be pretty different. But we typically say that a conservation easement tends to be about 50% of the value, the fair market value of a piece of property. So everything we do is based on an appraisal. So we get a qualified appraiser in order to assess what the actual fair market value and easement value of a piece of property would be. But as you're doing estimates, we tend to think that a conservation easement is about 50% of the fair market value.
Bo has two questions. Bo would like to know, are all of the lands open to the public? And if no, why not? And then the second question, can I visit your conservation easement lands?
Great question. So our fee simple lands, we own about those 12,000 acres. And not all of those are open to the public. So when we receive a piece of property through whatever means, and we're going to own it as a fee simple project, we make a management plan for that piece of property and decide if public use and public access makes sense. So that decision is based on a lot of different things. So including access to the property. Maybe it's landlocked. A lot of our fee simple land donations are donated to us because there's no legal access to the property, which means there would be no legal access for anyone who wanted to hike or visit the property either. Size is also a consideration. We tend to want to be able to put in a significant enough trail system for it to be of great use to many people in the community. So we usually now tend towards larger pieces of property for our nature preserves. And we look at demand in the area as well. And we're thinking about the ecosystems that are on that site. So we want people to be able to visit important ecosystems and interact with our rare natural features, but we want them to be protected as well. So for properties that have something that could be impacted negatively by human interaction, we don't want those to be open to the public. So we have some properties that have some rare lichens on them, and those take a lot of maintenance through prescribed burns, and they can be trampled easily and destroyed. So we don't open those to the public. And Casey, what was the second part?
Bo had asked if he could visit the conservation easement lands.
So again, that kind of depends. So some of the conservation easement lands, they're all owned by private landowners. Some of them have allow public visitation. So like Maple View Farm is one of our properties that is under conservation easement, but in the summertime you can go there for ice cream. So there are conservation easement properties that you can visit, but that's really up to individual landowners. So usually when there is a property that's open to the public that we've conserved, we will post about it on our blog or website and encourage you to go see it.
We have a question about the drone photo in the background of the question section. Sandy would like to know if that is a drone photo of white pine.
Actually, it is not. This is taken by our dear conservation friend, Margaret Fields. And this was on a day when I went out to monitor one of our owned properties, our fee simple properties in northern Durham County. And she came out with me and took some drone footage. This is one of our Snow Hill properties, so it's pretty close to Horton Grove. And it was a dreary day, but a nice photo.
Thanks, Margaret. We have one final question. And perhaps you could hear me if I didn't accidentally mute myself. How can we help TLC through the Corona crisis? What are some of the ways that we can help TLC?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that chiming in on things like this, keeping us in the forefront of your minds is great. Staying involved, even though we aren't able to gather in person, we're really having to be creative with how we reach out to y'all. When my 3 years on the development team, we were doing 60 events per year. So going to 0 all of a sudden has really cramped our style. But I'm glad that y'all were able to join us tonight, and I hope you can join us next week and encourage people you know to also sign in. And our nature preserves are still open to the public. So you can go to visit our nature preserves. We do implore you to please respect social distancing and keep a safe distance between you and anyone else who's visiting the preserves, and show a little love to the lesser visited ones. Everyone goes to Brumley, which is beautiful, but try Horton Grove, try White Pines, Flower Hill if you have the time. And of course, we would encourage you to please become a member of Triangle Land Conservancy. It's a scary time for a lot of organizations, and we are really grateful for the support that we've received so far, and we're hoping that we can keep doing the work that we've been doing, but we really need y'all to help us in order to make that happen.
And where can you become a member to TLC, Margaret, if you can share that?
That would be www.triangleland.org. And hopefully there will be an email that goes out after this webinar with some resources, and that'll have our information in there as well.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. This concludes Conservation Conversations, Conservation Start to Stewardship. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and a big thank you and kudos to Margaret for sharing your expertise.
Thanks so much for having me.
We love having you present on all of your expertise. Please join us next week for Conservation Conversations Steering the Stewardship with the TLC's Matt Rutledge and Caroline Durham. They will be talking about what land stewardship means and how TLC takes care of our protected lands during our 3rd Conservation Conversations webinar. We hope that you stay safe, stay healthy, and please continue to wash your hands and maintaining social distance. Thank you again, and please take care.